I'm Jim Rinaman. I was a lawyer in Jacksonville, came here in 1960, and in 1965 I became involved in what became the consolidated government because I was a lawyer for the Duval delegation in 1965, and that's when the legislature created the study commission. Then I was on the study commission, and then I was helpful in the campaign. I also helped draft the charter, and then 2 years later, I became the general counsel of the city for 2 years, and been following our consolidated government ever since.
So we could correctly say that you are one of the architects of this.
Well, in the sense that I was on the three-person committee that drafted the charter,
Yeah.
and that I was on the study commission that did the recommendations, and I was the chairman of the Public Utilities Task Force, which recommended the JEA and a number of other things about utilities around town.
And as you look back now, almost 50 years later, as we approach the 50th anniversary of consolidation, what do you think?
Well, I think it's been a great success, and we've had, compared to what we had at the time, and what we would have had if we hadn't done it, I think we're way ahead of the game. We've had our problems. We even had one of the things that created consolidated government was terrible governmental corruption with public officials. And we've had one episode of that in the 80s again, but we survived it. And we've also had some problems with getting infrastructure, particularly in the northwest part of Jacksonville, brought up to speed because of years and years of neglect. And we still are behind the 8 ball on that.
Well, no one who was drafting the consolidated government promised that it would be scandal-free, right?
I guess not.
Because
I guess
that depend on who you elect?
that comes under the heading of structure is not important, people are important.
Yeah.
And I think that's a fair game.
And we haven't figured out how to fix that.
No, we work at it though.
Well, since you've been working on drawing up this new government, and not a lot of role models, though it was Nashville and maybe a couple of other places.
Well, there were some others. Actually, there have been about 50 cities, beginning with Philadelphia and New York and San Francisco back in the 1880s, that have consolidated governments. But on balance, I've kept up with that over the years, and I would say 2/3 of the people who look at consolidated government don't do it because they don't have the will to toss out their public officials. The public officials come in and say, what's wrong with what we're doing? And I make speeches. I've made 40 or 50 speeches around the country to commissions that were looking at consolidated government, and I wind up by saying what you need is disaccredited schools and half your public officials in jail for bribery and larceny, and a tax base that's not capable of supporting your infrastructure. And if you can get there, you can get consolidated government.
And since you were campaigning in 1967 to get people to vote yes
Right.
on consolidation, I guess those things were uppermost in their minds.
Very much so. And particularly, I think, most important, in 1965, Pat Conroy, my law partner, sued the Ralph Walters, the tax assessor, and said that the statute that said that we should have just value in tax assessing meant market value. And Judge Bill Durden, who later became a general counsel of the city, wrote that opinion, and it was sustained by the Supreme Court. And as a result, in 1965, or 1966 actually, 70% of the people in Jacksonville began paying taxes for the first time. My wife reminded me that our house, which was worth $17,500 in Lakewood, we had a tax of $19 a year. And that tax probably went up to a couple of hundred. But I think that excited the interest in better government because people were paying taxes and they weren't ignoring the corruption as much as they had. But then you had the disaccredited schools, and you had the indicted public officials who all went to jail, and you had the sewage, all the subdivisions built after World War II, sewage plants had broken down, and raw sewage was coming in, I think it was 147 outlets into the St. Johns River. All of those things came together to convince people that we needed a new government.
And evidently, they had no confidence that the existing governmental structure could or would do anything about those things.
Oh, no question about it. It was a very complex government. It had city commissioners and city councilmen. And you had county commissioners. You had a budget commission, and there was no accountability. And there was lots of corruption. In fact, there was more corruption than those that were indicted. Several people resigned and didn't get indicted, and it's a long story.
As you started drafting the charter for the new government and deciding exactly how it was going to work, and as you look back, are there compromises that were made that you regret? What changes would you like to have made?
Well, let me say the charter was not required in the study commission report. The study commission report was supposed to make a recommendation, but they didn't tell us to do a charter. But Jack Daniel, the chairman, decided we should do a charter, and he appointed Jack Chambers, a lawyer at Mahoney Hadlow, to be the chairman of that, and appointed me and Ted Grissett to assist him. And actually Jack put the charter together based on several other charters like Nashville, and then we edited it with him for a month or so, and then we submitted that. Now that charter suggested, and the study commission suggested, number one, that we have appointed sheriff and appointed clerk of the court and appointed tax assessor, tax collector, supervisor of elections, and that was rejected by the legislature as a compromise because they feared that the people wouldn't go for that. And I've always regretted that, particularly as to the sheriff. We've been very fortunate. The mayors and the sheriffs over the history have gotten along very well. But if they didn't get along and we had a big emergency, we would have a real problem. And the mayor has no power over the sheriff, only the governor. And so it makes it very difficult. But it's worked, so I guess if it's working, you shouldn't break it.
I suppose.
Now, we had some other changes that were recommended that weren't accepted. One was to make the Civil Service Board, which was elected, make it appointive and give it less power, because they then were writing the rules for personnel and also enforcing the rules, and they even handled the appeals of their own decisions. And but the JCCI got onto that in a few years, and 14 years later we finally got an appointive board that has only appellate jurisdiction, and that worked out. Those are the two most important things that didn't get done. And of course you had the other thing that the Constitution required that the new consolidated government had to be a municipality throughout the boundaries of Duval County. And that was a very difficult problem because the Beaches and Baldwin didn't want to be a part of it. And we come up with a kind of a legal fiction, and instead of, we said they're going to be urban service districts of the consolidated government with all the same powers and officials and so forth of the former municipalities.
And how has that worked?
Well, it's worked out pretty well. The people at the Beaches and Baldwin pay more taxes and pay higher fire rates and things like that, but they like it, and they like having their own mayor and their own police chief and their own fire chief, and as long as they like it, I guess it's all right.
And they all supported, they voted, I think?
They did
yes.
vote for it. They all voted for it,
Yep.
and they all voted to opt out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, speculate, if you can, about what Jacksonville would be like if they voted no on consolidation in '67.
Well, if they had voted no, we would have had to go back to annexation. And that had failed 2 or 3 times because people in the county did not want to be part of the corrupt city. City was only 37 square miles and about 150,000 people. The county was 844 square miles and 350,000 people. And so if we had not had consolidation, we'd have had to go back to trying to get gradual annexation, and I think that would have been very difficult. And the other problem is that the 37 square miles had by that time gotten to be 40% black, and people were leaving, the white people were leaving and moving out to the county, and so the tax base in the city was very, very low. There were very few businesses, and so it was a bad situation. And if we had not consolidated, I think that the 37 square mile city would have collapsed economically because of a low tax base.
We're talking about the 60s, and we all know the civil rights history of the 60s.
Right.
How much of a factor was race in the election for consolidation?
Well, I didn't perceive it as being a very big factor, but there are some black leaders, even today, that think it was, and I don't understand why they do continue to persist in that, because I think as Earl Johnson, who was the was the secretary of the Consolidation Commission and was on the city council when the new consolidated government took over, he was asked by some of the black leadership to not support it and to become the first black mayor of the 37 square miles. And he said, I don't want to be the mayor of a bankrupt city. And so he supported consolidation. And I think that's the whole story.
And it is speculation to think what it would be like, but what do you think, because of consolidation, we might be able to have today that we wouldn't have had otherwise?
Well, we put in 17,000 streetlights that we didn't have. We had a fire and rescue service. Before consolidation, ambulance service was handled by the funeral homes, and they would take their ambulances out to a scene of an accident, and they would the first guy that got there loaded all the corpses, and then the second guy had to take the injured people in, and they were making a lot of money on that, but it wasn't very effective and very efficient. And we ended up with a world-class fire rescue operation that Captain Waters came in and created, and the fire insurance rates went down about five categories in the city because of the new fire department and the new getting away from volunteer firemen and having the rescue service. So there were a number of things like that that happened that wouldn't have happened otherwise.
Are there anecdotes that come to mind in the early days when the charter was being drafted and so forth that you can tell us about that probably a lot of people don't know?
Well, the fun anecdote is the black hats and the white hats.
Yeah.
In those days, we didn't have one man, one vote. And there were 5 senators from Duval County and 11 representatives. And all the people in the north end of the state controlled the legislature, much to the chagrin of the people in the south. And that was changed a few years after consolidation. But what happened was we had, of the 5 senators, they all supported consolidation vehemently. But 6 of the 11 House members, who we call black hats, were devotees of the old government in the Hayden Burns-Blitzer era, and they were against consolidation, and they did everything they could to stop it. But we ended up finally getting 6 votes by talking Linwood Arnold into signing on it, and it turned out all right. But we had a long period of time when it was in doubt, and the black hats kept putting in amendments that were destructive. And every Monday morning we met for about 2 hours on 7 a.m. And the Chamber of Commerce sent busloads over Sunday night who would come and just sit in and loom over the delegation, trying to keep them straight in favor of consolidation. And the amendments, we ended up with about 200 amendments. And the black hats thought that since it was only a few days before the into the legislative session, we finally got it on the ballot, got it filed, that we couldn't get those amendments on. But I had 5 lawyers at that time that were working for me, and those lawyers had been keeping those amendments up. We didn't have computers, we didn't have anything but Xerox machines to operate with, but we had done the amendments and had them in files, and so we put them all together in 2 days and got it filed.
So August 1967, the election, and it was approved overwhelmingly.
65%, 67%, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
And that's a bad time to have an election, by the way.
August.
Yeah.
Yeah. So after that, there was the responsibility of electing politicians to run this new government.
Right.
So electing a mayor and 19 city council members. When was that election?
Well, Hans Tansler had just been elected mayor. He came off the bench as a judge, and he'd been elected mayor of the old city. And we had 2 or 3 city councilmen, like John Lanahan, Ted Grissett, who were on the new city council. And in fact, that was kind of detrimental because the Black Hats were arguing, well, we've solved it all because we got all these reform people running the government. But in any event, Hans was in a situation where he had run with 150,000 people in a 37 square mile, and if he endorsed consolidation and it happened, he'd have to run again in 844 square miles and 350,000 people. So Hober Humphreys, Lex Hester, who was the chairman of the study commission, or the executive director of the study commission, and I went out to Hans's house one Sunday and sat down with him for a couple hours and talked to him about it. And he agreed to support consolidation in spite of the fact that he'd have to run again. And Hank Drain called him up at the appropriate time, and he announced what he was doing. It was in the headlines the next day.
Hank Drain was a Times Union.
It was a Times Union reporter. And so we ended up with, I think, a very important part of the reason why we got such a good vote was that Hans endorsed it. And then Hans created a transition committee, which I was on. And one of my assignments was to get a new general counsel because we had decided that we were going to have one set of lawyers to represent all governmental bodies. And that has worked out very well, but the main reason it's worked out well is because I was able to persuade Judge Durden, who'd done the tax case, to come over, go off the bench and become the general counsel for 2 years. And he came over and he wrote 276 advisory opinions, which put us on the course of making the government work. And that was a real godsend. He also defended a very serious constitutional case that Ray Green brought to try to stop consolidation, and he defended that successfully in the Supreme Court. He was very proud of the fact that in his tax case and also in his consolidation case, his opinion was almost adopted verbatim by the Supreme Court. And he said that was the ultimate compliment.
So the new consolidated government included some people who had been in the old city government.
It did.
But it also included city council members who had no previous political experience.
A lot of those, a lot of them.
Which may have been a good thing.
Well, it was a good thing, and within a few years after that, Jack McDaniel, Lex Hester, Jack Chambers, myself, David Hicks, and several others created the JCCI. The idea being to keep people involved like they had been in the consolidated government campaign. And they produced about 50 very important reports over a period of years, which solved a lot of problems. And it worked out very well. And also out of that came Leadership Jacksonville, which Fred Schultz spurred. He was on the JCCI board, and then he went over to run the Leadership Jacksonville. And that's been worked out very nicely, too.
You would say that Earl Johnson Sr.
Yeah.
was correct when he referred to a bankrupt city. If we didn't do consolidation, what would it be like? Maybe a bankrupt city?
Well, I don't think there's any doubt about that because the tax base was shrinking
Yeah.
and the expenses and the problems were getting worse. We didn't have the ambulance service, and we didn't have the garbage service, and we didn't have the street lights and so forth that we were able to get under consolidation because of the broad tax base.
Most of the people who live here today have never known anything but consolidation.
Right,
So they don't exactly have a good feel for the historic importance of it.
right.
I guess that's part of what this 50th anniversary is all about.
That's true. We want to remind people of it and let them learn about it and how it happened and what it's doing and the difference between how it would have been without it.
So you went on to become general counsel, the second general counsel.
Right, I was the second general counsel. Now, that's an interesting thing. Bill Durden wrote 276 advisory opinions. I wrote about 60. And then after that, Ed Austin was my successor, and he wrote about 30. And since him, they've written more than, 3 or 4 a year because everything's been solved.
Yeah.
And
So what about your tour of duty as general counsel recollections?
well, I enjoyed that very much. What happened was that when Bill Durden insisted that he had to leave in 2 years and go to the Kent firm where he was going to practice law and make some money, and so Hans called on me to go out and find another general counsel, and I found Ed Austin, which would be perfect. He was a very, very popular and very good lawyer, and would have a lot of influence in running the government. And Bill Durden used to say that it's not a strong mayor form of government, it's a strong general counsel form of government. And Ed was a good example of that. But Ed said he couldn't leave in the middle of his term. Politically, he became mayor later, and he was anticipating that he didn't want anybody criticizing him for leaving his state attorney's office before the end of the term, which was a year and a half later. So I talked to my law firm, and I said, I'd like to take a 2-year leave of absence, go over there and be the general counsel, and then let Ed come in and take over. And they said, okay. And so I went back to Hans, and I said, I got some good news and some bad news. Ed will come, but he won't come for a year and a half. But in the interim, c'est moi, I'll come. And so it all worked out very nicely. And I was very pleased with it. I enjoyed it very much. And we built a very good, before consolidation, we had about 40 lawyers representing different entities of the government. And it was costing about $500,000–600,000 a year. After consolidation with Bill Durden, we ended up with no lawyers representing anybody except the general counsel. And we ended up spending about $300,000 for the lawyers. And plus, we got a whole lot better legal services and much more coordination. That's one of the important things about the general counsel's office. It's kind of the nerve center of the city because they're representing all of the different agencies, and so they can cross-level issues and problems and make sure that they're not getting in each other's way.
And the general counsel is not the mayor's attorney.
No.
It represents
Not at all.
various parts of the city.
He's the city's attorney.
Yeah.
It's like the lawyer for General Motors. The general counsel for General Motors doesn't represent the CEO. He doesn't represent Cadillac or Chevrolet. He represents everybody, and he's responsible for everybody. And that's what we had here.